Yundi Teela, I'm Teela Nadu, Winang Nangay E, Yinjamara, Marangay, May, Jurinya, Barambu, Nurambangabu. I am Teela. I pay my respects to this country and I pay my respects to the first peoples to be born to this country. I am a visitor on this country. Thank you for the invitation to be here tonight, especially at this particularly cold occasion, so thank you all for coming out. As has been introduced, I primarily come to this conversation on the national stage first and foremost as a Wiradjuri and Wailwan woman, secondly as a lawyer, and also someone who has never really been campaigning yes or campaigning no. I'm just a little bit somewhere in between, and hopefully bringing to this conversation more of a middle ground yarn and debate. And that's always the perspective that I have taken, despite what some media has said lately about opinions. It always has been really important to me that everyday Australians feel like they are part of this conversation. I just so happened to be towards the end of my law degree and very early when I worked for a judge in New South Wales, quite interested in the conversations that were already happening around our country in law school, and at that particular time was really about the last referendum we had, which is about the Republic. Hand up if you all remember the Republic, conversation. And so that was really how I was identified as someone who might be a younger voice, not really either side of the campaign, but more of a middle ground, because lots of my community at that time as well were talking about sovereignty. And one of the conversations I was I took a very kind of critical thinking aspect to, because during my undergraduate degree, I just so happened to live in Canada and have lots of that kind of international experience about what was already happening on the ground in different like nations like Australia. The way in which I became part of the process underpinning the Uluru Statement was really, I was asked to speak on a particular power, and that was the race power. And so, as a very keen law student and early lawyer working for a Supreme Court judge in New South Wales, I was invited along to discuss some of the decisions around this particular race power. And I think that's a good starting point for this, because that's the way I see this conversation. Lots of people think, oh, she's talking about racism, she means I'm racist. That's not, that's how my opinions have been misinterpreted. In terms of the race power, Australia, when it was founded as a nation, inbuilt within its system, the forefathers built in something called a race power. That's the particular expertise I've taken on this. So from the very beginning, First Nations peoples, or Aboriginal peoples, as some people call it around the continent, were excluded from the Federation. That's just a fact, by virtue of the operation of this race power. And I facilitated conversations in rooms like this actually, but full of First Nations elders, conversations about how that power had been used over time in Australia. And so that's the reality lots of First Nations peoples, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had to grapple with. We grappled with this structural issue of the race power within the Federation and how that had operated. This essentially was the critical change in 1967. So in 67, what happened was that no longer could federal parliament not make laws in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That was the critical change. In 1967, 90.77% of Australians voted yes at that referendum for simply federal parliament to make laws in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And what didn't happen though, which is the issue you and I are all grappling with today and how we navigate this, is can Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have input into those laws? That's where the idea of the voice really comes into the conversation, into the debate. Finally, we have a federation where federal parliament, our elected representatives, can make laws in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but we do not currently have a system that allows First Nations input into that. That's the simple structural dilemma. And this was noted by the Referendum Council most recently leading into the 2017 report around the Referendum Council. They said this, and this is their direct quote. This is not me making an opinion about anything. But as the Referendum Council noted around the Uluru Statement and leading into it, and I should say this Referendum Council was formed under the Turnbull government, it had noted that every Prime Minister and leader of the Federation, particularly in the modern era that we now exist, understood this exclusion. They understood not only that historical exclusion from Federation to 67, but the dilemma now of First Nations peoples not having input into those lawmaking. So Whitlam said this. He spoke of the need of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to, quote, take their rightful place in this nation, end quote. Prime Minister Fraser, he established the Senate inquiry, whose report titled, I should say, 200 years later, report by the Senate Standing Committee on Constitutional and Legal Affairs for the feasibility of a compact or Makarrata. That was written in 1983. So Makarrata is not even a new concept. Prime Minister Hawke understood, and he was gifted the Barunga Statement with his commitment and political promise to make a treaty, and we know that at the federal level that never came to pass. Prime Minister Keating is quoted as saying how well we recognise the fact that as complex as our contemporary identity is, it can't be separated from Aboriginal Australia, end quote, in his Redfern speech. Prime Minister Howard committed to a referendum in 2007. He said on that night, I quote, I believe we must find room in our national life to formally recognise the special status of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as the first peoples of our nation, end quote. Turnbull invited this conversation around the dialogues in the rooms where we got to talk about the race power and this structural dilemma. And he said, ultimately, when the Uluru Statement was gifted to him, he dismissed it as a third chamber, so that dishonesty aspect, and lied about what this is, and that's really one of the issues, and he's since backtracked and retracted his statement in relation to that. Prime Minister Morrison, he won the 2019 election on the commitment to go to a referendum, and with the earmarking, this is Morrison, earmarked $160 million, but he didn't question the concept of recognition, he debated the voice though. And Prime Minister Albanese, as we all know now, that brings us to this moment that we're at, promised the referendum, and we are now moving towards that moment, towards the end of the year. And I should say, in all the conversations I've had in rooms like this, the politicians will not do this for us. It is people on seats engaging in conversations exactly like you are, where the real change I have seen grow across the nation. And so I don't think we can let this opportunity pass us by. I mean, if you are persuaded by the no case, I do ask you though to ask yourself then, what is the alternative? Where do we go? What do we build from the outcome of a no case? What does that do to our relationship as a nation? Is there something else on the table? And so I do want to make it clear that I'm not here to persuade you either way, but I am trying to cut through the noise, and there is certainly a lot of noise. And particularly as a lawyer, I feel like I want, and for example for my community as well, to understand that when they get to the ballot box that they're making an informed choice about this. That people, and you should know, when you go to the ballot box, it's not like ticking 1, 2 for, a normal election. You have to write yes or you write no. And these are some of the old rules now being enlivened around a referendum process. I personally have never voted in a referendum. I do hope, though, for our nation that we can find the middle ground. I do hope that if there is one thing I have learned in my conversations across the continent, in real rooms like this, in real life, not social media, not the media, but I have learned in rooms like this, we actually have more alike than we have apart. There is more in common than there are differences. It is not the law that is difficult in the context of the voice. This is a really simple amendment, but what makes it difficult is the political debate and the political noise and everything we are now hearing as a result of the spread of misinformation. So how do we digest that? The idea of Indigenous voice is not a new concept, nor is it really unique to Australia. It's around the world, there are many different models of the way in which the Indigenous peoples of particular continents engage with their governments or the nation. For example, as we know, and many of you would have travelled to either Aotearoa or New Zealand or Canada or North America or sometimes even in Scandinavia, they have their own First Nations parliaments. This is not a new concept. And in fact, the idea on the table is even much less than that now, in terms of no one is asking for seats in the Senate, no one is asking for a veto power, it's simply the power to make representations. And unlike, for example, somewhere like New Zealand or the Maori culture, where they have the consistency of the one First Nation, we are also grappling with in Australia the many different First Nations. And I think while that can be a challenge, I think that is the beauty of our country. I genuinely do think that that is one of the gifts of this nation, and I think we should all really be embracing the opportunity that presents us here. And I often think about, if you can close your eyes and imagine the Uluru Statement from the Heart, yes, there are the words about the voice in Makarrata, but lots of people get lost, and I've even said this directly to politicians who are out on the ground debating. Is anyone talking about the gift of the Jukupa law, the gift of the story, the gift of the art, the generosity, what is around the statement, and the feeling of how we, when people talk about sovereignty, some people talk about it in the concept of, for example, Western authority and decision making, when in fact you could say at the other end of it, an expression of that is that law, is the art, is our stories, is our ceremony. And I think we still have a long way to go in unpacking the way in which we can define differently the same concepts, such as sovereignty. So how far have we come and how far do we have to go? I will attempt to answer that in part, really, just through the movement behind the Uluru Statement. I do want to emphasise, though, that it is people like you, it is people power that changes nations. It is activism and advocacy on the ground that creates the real change. Our country is on the cusp of significant change. That is undeniable. And I think when you start to feel the tension and the discomfort that comes with the moment that we're at, rather than walking away from it, I think we all need to embrace it and have those conversations with our families about what this means to us on a national storytelling scale. It has absolutely been people power that has got us here. Everyday Australians, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, working together and collaborating on this issue. It has been us holding the political institutions to account, and it is absolutely conversations like this in community spaces that create the change. It does lay before us. Generational change is realised when we power movements. And our ability to influence this change doesn't mean that we all have to agree, but it does mean we move united despite our differences. And I think embracing our differences will be a remarkable challenge, but we will come out at the end of this, I think, being such a more mature nation. And to understand this point, I don't want to really get bogged down in what the yes are saying and what the no are saying, because I've also, I think, in my view, there are three things that I would like you to take away from tonight that is missing, I think, on social media, in the general political space, which is this. And I'll attempt to break them down in part. First, and it's the three Ps. First, it's the purpose of a referendum. Second, the principles of the design of the voice. And third, the prospects of this moment. And when we talk about often what is the purpose of a referendum, some people say, well, we can just go get a voice up tomorrow and then test it and then go to a referendum. The idea actually is for us to ensure that the people of Australia mandate this. That this is, again, addressing that historical wrong of recognition and putting that in part of our nation's founding document. I am proud to be Australian. There's no denying that. I've travelled the world and it is an absolute genuine gift to be here on this continent. I think as well, when I think about this from a legal perspective, in relation to what gets lost when people go, we want more detail, the referendum itself is simply to enable the voice design process. This allows the voice to grow over time. So in the context of, for example, a successful referendum, we're not going to wake up the next day and this voice suddenly appear at our doorsteps. This is actually an opportunity to nation build into the future. And of course, it requires a double majority. So the purpose of going to a referendum to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples finally in our nation's founding document is hopefully for you to mandate that. And that is one of the most difficult democratic tasks in the nation, a double majority. And to guarantee that this exists beyond political cycles. So lots of people in this room as well can imagine past Aboriginal advisory bodies such as the NACC, FCATSIA, ATSIC even is one. One of the things that actually is a detriment to Indigenous policy is when we change governments from Labor, Liberal, coalition, it actually is very detrimental to the long-term vision of Indigenous policy. But how do we get there? So the design principles. Before I discuss the design principles that will go into the creation of the voice, if successful, I wanted to ask each of you, who has read the Constitution? In all seriousness, hands up. Okay. I actually had to get my phone. On my way out of my office the other day, I was like, oh my gosh, I got that in law school, and lots of people obviously think about this document as if it's some grand, over-enduring document with enormous detail, but this is it, guys. This is the Australian Constitution. This is what we're all debating. And I think that I thought, oh my gosh, that is such a useful thing to take on these talks, because the debate has become so enormous and so overwhelming, and it all boils down to this. The way in which we're simply trying to insert, I had the chat to Professor George Williams the other day, who is the Dean of my old law school, who is a conservative lawyer, and he was the expert on, one of the experts on the panel for the amendment. And he's like, yeah, it just boils down to 92 words. And we're having this crazy debate on social media and, across the news every day about it. And that's because the design is simply to embed the principle that the voice exists. And so when you get to the ballot box, you're simply going to be asked one question: a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. And I think that actually says a lot about this moment. There is no division in this. This is a unifying First Peoples of Australia. It's an embrace of that history. Do you approve? You're going to have to vote yes or no. And the amendment itself is not in any of the yes or no pamphlets that have come out this week, so I want you to go back and have a look at the little paragraph that is hopefully going to be inserted in here. But it simply has 3 sections to it. One is to may make representations, so not must, make representations. to the Parliament and government, but the power to, the Parliament shall have the power to make these laws respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, its functions, powers and procedures. In my view, and with other conservative lawyers as well, it makes it very clear that the voice itself will be outside of Parliament, simply making representations. Albanese has made it very clear, I think as of today, if you were listening to the news, he was already going to make the decision around, well, he's not considering, for example, any issue around abolishing Australia Day, which I'll be very transparent. I mean, my tweet got chopped and edited and shipped into the no case around abolishing Australia Day. I didn't think that that would be part of the voice, for example. So be very wary of the way quotes are being taken and inserted into different contexts, because you do lose the meaning in this. And I think if you don't have a critical eye over the articles you're reading, the opinions, the news, then you will also get a bit lost in this debate, because I'm getting lost with things I've written myself and going, what meaning is being brought to this? But finally, on this issue of the design principles and kind of this hysteria now picking apart the amendment that is to go into our enormous constitution, reminds me a lot of the commentary around Mabo. Some of you might remember, when that High Court decision come down, we were going to take your backyards, and that wasn't the intention, I believe, of the Torres Strait Islander community. And this kind of fear played into the media, and I do believe that that's being stifled again now, and I think it's important to cast a critical eye over it, because I think we can look back now as a nation on this great achievement that was Mabo and say that that changed the narrative of our nation. We all get to embrace more of us as a nation because of changes like that to our narrative and who gets to tell that story. And the Uluru Dialogues that's co-chaired by Anipat and Megan have also put these guiding principles for the design principles, what comes after a referendum, on their website. And this is also not necessarily in the either of the campaigns, but I do think it's worth summarising that it's simply to give advice. It's simply to speak about the local community. It's not the Canberra voice, it's about local communities. So if you go to, actually even today I went to some Aboriginal organisations here, and if I go back home, no one really, genuinely, there are very few Aboriginal people I know that really want to lead their communities. They love and adore their local community where this change happens, and it actually is all about the changes they would like to see and the relationships built in their local community. And for that to have gender balance and representation of age groups, and for it to be community-led. And there will be no veto power. So please be conscious of anything that really kind of tries to derail your thinking about how simple this is, because this is really a common sense opportunity we have here. And the flexibility in it, the flexibility of just putting a paragraph in here is its strength. It's not a detriment. The fact that we get to grow this as a nation, we've already learned that one-size models in the past do not fit all Aboriginal communities. Again, New Zealand, very different. We have over 250 First Nations. What it looks like a year after a successful referendum might look very different when our children inherit it. And I speak on behalf of, I think, non-Indigenous children as well, who I think are all learning a different history to even what we learned at school. So its design and flexibility is a strength. The voice is really about providing new pathways to make representations on behalf of local communities. And there's also, I think, needs to be raised about, people are saying, well, this is only for 3% of the population, when in fact, if you look at Tasmania, it gets 12 senators for that jurisdiction. And, this is about improving the democratic processes. There is, even the things that exist in our current democracy, you could genuinely say, well, that's not equitable either. But, those concerns, in my view, don't stack up. When I facilitated these conversations, specifically I should say in relation to the race power, lots of our Aboriginal communities spoke about things like Mabo and Wick and Cartonieri decisions. It's actually impractical for us to get to the High Court. These cases genuinely take minimum 10 to 20 years to work their way through. The idea of the voice was to make the representations to help decision makers, to improve the democratic process, to avoid the costs and the time that it takes to actually litigate, which is the same situation we're in now. So I also think in my lived experience of speaking to communities and being on the ground, people really don't want to go to the High Court. It takes way too long to get there. And often, for example, I think what's lost in something like Mabo is that he passed before the High Court made that decision. And we honestly don't have that time to start to try and close the gap. And so, yeah, I do want people to reflect on those arguments and critically think about that, because I do think, thirdly and finally, there are great prospects in this if we get it right. There genuinely is. This is a momentous year, an opportunity to reset this dialogue, to create a new chapter in our nation's story. The greatest risk for the local communities on so many levels is just not giving this a shot. The status quo is really detrimental at the moment, and so if you are persuaded again by the no case, then what do we do next? Where's the opportunities? What are we growing for our nation? I mean, genuinely mean that together. The government have identified the 4 focused areas, which is health, housing, education and jobs. This week, if you want to listen on your way to work or home tonight, I interviewed Professor George Williams on my latest podcast. It's called Black Matters. He's an ally in this space. He's co-authored with Megan Davis. And we spoke about this moment and where we're at. And he genuinely said, these are direct quotes from him, you know, there are polarizing arguments on both sides, the yes and the no. Where we're at now with what's being published is, I quote from his words, problematic on so many levels, and what we're currently doing is not effective. And the great danger, he says, is there's no requirement to be truthful. So there are wild statements and hyperbole out there. So I invite you to find the middle ground with me. To not buy into the fear. Fear is easy. What can we create in terms of opportunity? If you are confronted with misinformation, cast a critical eye over that. Let's embrace this possibility. I do think, you know, we have a chance to build a better nation and not detract from it. Recently, I have struggled a bit in this space. Let's just say that, you know, people go, oh my God, this is hard yakka. It seriously is hard yakka. It's a marathon, not a race. And so I was drawn back over the last few days to Alexis Wright's words, she wrote this essay in the Monthly, and I recommend that as well. And its title is, In Times Like This, What Would Oodgeroo Do? And I've thought about this because Oodgeroo, as you know, Kath Walker was a leading campaigner in 1967. And Alexis writes this, and I want to end on this. Alexis writes this about Oodgeroo. When I read Oodgeroo's poems, I delight in her extraordinary creative powers, and I can see how she celebrated Aboriginal people as the inheritors of a heroic culture, still fighting and surviving, as we have done since time immemorial. On the centenary of her birth, I humbly offer my love and gratitude to this great lady of our culture for her leadership as a poet and thinker during the difficult times in which she lived. Oodgeroo created a greater space for our independent creativity and literature. She was fearless and determined to show the world that we owned what we thought, our creativity, our stories, and that justice was on our side. Our literary efforts today grew from this space that she and others of her generation forged from traditional roots. We go back a long time as storytellers, story makers and story keepers. We practice many forms of storytelling every day. We have always lived and sung stories. Through adherence to our religious law and practice a highly sophisticated writing system and coding thoughts to preserve, important stories of responsibility passed down through the ages to teach new generations to care for this fragile continent, the oldest in the world. These stories have helped us survive the oldest living culture in the world, end quote. And so I ask you, in the words of Alexis Wright, in times like this, what would Oodgeroo do? I think Oodgeroo would stand on the right side of history. Thank you.